What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. Today we're going to check out the macro that I've created for Frost Mages starting out in the War Within. Now, this video likely will release after the War Within launches, but keep in mind this is a starting out video, which means it's designed with level 70 characters and lower in mind. So we're not going to be looking at hero talents just yet. We're still a level 70, and it's as if we are starting out fresh in the War Within. Don't worry, we will take a look at hero talents and builds later on down the road once, time has passed and I actually get a chance to play the expansion, okay? So I want to make that very clear, but the good news is that as mages go, Frost Mage is incredibly easy to simplify with Gnome Sequencer. Mages have traditionally been somewhat problematic, but I really like the playstyle of the Frost Mage here. It's actually pretty simple for the most part. So let's go ahead and open up our talent tree and we can look at what build I'm running with. On the left side, it's mostly utility. I mean, it's all good stuff, but most of the stuff on the left side is going to be utility focused. There are some abilities that do deal damage. I mean, you've got Blast Wave, you've got Dragon's Breath, even this one here, I considered putting this one in the macro, Shifting Power, but I decided not to. Ice Nova, Ice Nova, Frost Nova, Cone of Cold, all those types of abilities, that you either have or you get on this side of the tree. If it's a utility-oriented ability, then it's not going to be included in the macro, even though a lot of those abilities can help you, get more critical strikes with Shatter, and freezing your target. We're still going to be using those on separate buttons. So that's something to keep in mind, but overall, it's just really important that you get the most out of those abilities, and putting them in the macro is not going to allow you to do that, okay? So on the right side of the tree is really where we're going to focus here. I mean, a lot of this is what you would expect to take for a Frost Mage, a lot of it's just standard, buffing your already used abilities and getting the most out of them. A lot of it's taking abilities that you're obviously going to need. Some optional ones that I've gone with, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to try to actually find out where they are in this tree. I mean, obviously you take things like, Icy Veins, you take Frozen Orb, those sorts of things, Fingers of Frost, Shatter, those sorts of, passive procs and buffs. Flurry, obviously, you're going to take all that stuff, but I have gone with Comet Storm. That's actually one that we're adding in, and I've also gone with, I believe it's down here somewhere, Glacial Spike is the other one. If I can't find it, I'm sorry. There it is, Glacial Spike. This is another really easy one to use. The cool thing about all of these abilities, Glacial Spike, it doesn't have a cooldown, but you can only use it under a very specific circumstance, which is cool. And then, of course, same with, Comet Storm actually does have a cooldown, so that's easy to macro. Pretty much everything else is passive. It's a standard, ability that you would obviously want to take or whatever, so that's pretty straightforward. So that's pretty much it. With that being said, let's go ahead and actually take a look at this macro, okay? So there is one macro for Frost Mages, but this is a 3-button setup we've got going here, and that's because of two abilities. The first one is Blizzard. Blizzard is a ground targeting ability. You're going to use it pretty much on cooldown when you're fighting multiple enemies, and trying to put a ground targeting ability in a macro, especially for a caster, just isn't going to work, because you're going to have to add either an @player command, which would make you cast Blizzard at your feet, which you don't want to do unless you're like one of those crazy, mages that runs in the middle of everything and tries to do damage that way. Or you can do mouse over, and then it will, drop Blizzard at your cursor. But if you're going to be doing that, you don't always know if your cursor is where it's supposed to be, and that could just lead to problems. So ground targeting abilities, especially for casters, are something that you're going to have to manage on a separate button, okay? So that's obvious. The other one, of course, is Ice Lance. This one is one you only use when you have Fingers of Frost or Winter's Chill or frozen targets, usually something like that. Mostly when you have Fingers of Frost proc, it doesn't have a cooldown, so that's not one that we could put in the macro because you only use it under very specific circumstances. So those two abilities you're going to have to manage on separate buttons. They're your primary, abilities outside of what's used in the macro. And then, of course, I didn't include these, obviously your utility abilities. Like I said, those will all be managed separately. So obviously your barrier, your buffs, Cone of Cold, Frost Nova, Ice Nova, anything like that you take, anything CC, obviously, those do need to be used on separate buttons. But as for your core rotation, everything else will be included in this macro. So let's go ahead and take a look at the actual macro. We are using a reverse priority macro. This is seemingly working pretty well, as this is a caster class, and caster classes tend to be more difficult, and that's because they have abilities that aren't instant cast, but they have a lot of abilities that you take a duration to cast the spell, and that can make things a little bit more challenging when trying to macro, because it does slow down your playstyle just a little bit. Okay, so the first thing, of course, is Flurry, and Flurry will be at the top of this priority here. We're doing reverse priority. Flurry will be the ability that is most commonly, gets the most attempts to be used because it's at the top of the priority. That's important because, we want to use Flurry and make sure that we're reusing it in case it comes off cooldown and trying to use it as much as possible. We've also included Icy Veins in here, so that way we're getting the most chances for this to go off. It's going to go off all the time. Whenever it's available, it should go off. We've added an at combat here, command, just to make sure that it doesn't go off when you're outside of combat, so you don't waste it outside of combat. Next up is Glacial Spike. Again, this will only be used when you have 5 icicles, so that's good. That makes it easy enough to macro, and when you have 5 icicles and you come to this ability, the macro will use it. It's pretty straightforward. And then last up is our filler ability, and this is Frost Bolt. Okay, so this will be used as your primary filler ability. The idea here is that the macro is going to try really hard to use either of these other abilities before it gets to Frostbolt. Most caster classes have that filler ability, and trying to macro that, depending on the class, can be difficult because the filler ability, the macro will either try to use it too much or it won't use it enough, and the macro will hang, trying to use abilities that it can't use because they're either on cooldown or they're just not available because there's no proc, or not enough icicles in the case of Glacial Spike, that kind of stuff. So that's a challenge for every caster class, but I seem to have figured out a pretty solid method to keep things pretty balanced, so that the macro's using Frostbolt when there's nothing else to do, but it's also not using it too much, preventing you from using your other abilities, and it's also not hanging up waiting to get to Frostbolt because it's trying to cycle through so many other abilities. So since there are only 3 abilities in this loop, that should give Frostbolt enough chances to get used, while making sure that these other abilities get just a little bit more of an opportunity to be used. And for the most part, that does seem to work, but we'll talk about drawbacks when we get to the end, okay? So as you see here, this is a repeat of 2, which means that the macro will cycle through this pattern twice, the reverse priority pattern twice, and then it will break out of this loop and go down to the abilities that are on the outside. The abilities that are on the outside have a longer cooldown. So usually for me, longer cooldown will be 30 seconds or greater. Anything that's 30 seconds or greater, you're not going to necessarily be using as often, and therefore the macro doesn't need to try to use those abilities as often. So we put them on the outside of the loop so that we're not bogging down the loop with long cooldown abilities and not using them, and then occasionally just breaking out of the loop instead to try and use them. And that's kind of the logic here for these abilities. So the first one, of course, is Comet Storm, has a relatively short cooldown. We also have Frozen Orb. And so those are our 2 primary abilities that we will be using, that in combat, that have longer cooldowns than the abilities that we'll be using inside of the loop. Of course, 2 of these don't even have cooldowns, but you get what I'm saying. We're going to be using the abilities in here a lot more often than we will be using the abilities on the outside. And so the macro will cycle through this loop twice in the reverse priority pattern, break out, try to use either of these 2 abilities or both, and then go back into the loop and do the loop again twice, and then break out and try to use them again. So you're getting a decent number of chances to use these abilities, but you're just not trying to use them all the time, and that should help keep the macro running smoothly. Now, obviously what this does mean is that this applies to anything in this macro that has a cooldown, or even Glacial. Consider 5 icicles the same as a cooldown for Glacial Spike. It's the same principle. it does mean that, like, there's no guarantee that the abilities are going to go off as soon as they come off cooldown, just because you are cycling through the macros. So sometimes it may take a cycle, it may take a second to get to those abilities, but in my experience, it does a pretty good job at keeping all those abilities on cooldown and using them as soon as they become available, and then just using Frostbolt whenever there's nothing else to do. That's the ideal scenario, and that seems to happen more often than not, but there may be a time or two where an ability doesn't go off as fast as you would like. So that's always something to remember. And then of course, you know, you do have certain buffs, procs, things like Shatter, Winter's Chill, all those things. The macro is not going to know when those things happen. It doesn't have the capabilities. This isn't, you know, a bot. We wouldn't want it to be a bot. It doesn't have the ability to understand nuance. It's simply a sequence. You're pressing a button and it's going through the sequence. You are still the one pressing the button, of course. And this is why I always like to say this every single time I make this video. I like to remind people that these are never going to perform nearly as well as a skilled player executing their rotation appropriately. So it doesn't understand the nuances of the class. It doesn't have the ability to, like you have the ability to. So you're going to obviously get much more out of your class if you play it without a sequencer macro, but this macro functionally will use all of your abilities. It will keep them on cooldown for you, leaving you to manage Ice Lance separately when you do get Fingers of Frost, when you do want to use Ice Lance, and Blizzard when you're in AoE situations and you want to use, you know, that on cooldown to keep that running. So otherwise you'll just spam away at this macro. It'll manage everything else for you, and it's really straightforward. And I leveled up this character through the Echoes event, and I had a lot of fun doing it. So it worked really well in that scenario. It was a lot of fun. You know, of course, having those other utility abilities available for solo content is good, but in general, it works pretty well, and I had a lot of fun with it, so I'm looking forward to going through the War Within with this macro. If you'd like to do the same, you're welcome to. You are free to import this into your game using Gnome Sequencer. If you do not forget to hotkey it, and if you use it, let me know what you think about it in the comments below. With all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button, and feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.